Hi, my name is David. Welcome back to my channel. Now, before I get into today's story, I want you to pour yourself a coffee, sit down, and just listen. Because this one right here, stayed with me for a long time. I rode for 31 years, saw a lot of things people wouldn't believe. But what these boys did in a little nobody town called Harlan Creek, I tell you, it changed how I see everything. All right, here we go. There is a kind of man that civilization has always needed but never wanted to admit it needs. The kind who lives just outside the clean edges of polite society, who knows the difference between a rule and a law, and chooses neither when neither is right, who owes nothing to nobody, and yet somehow keeps showing up when the rest of the world drives past with its windows rolled up. The Iron Vow MC had 41 members across 2 chapters, most of them veterans, ex-welders, divorced fathers, men with back problems and long memories and a deep distrust of anything that wore a badge without earning it. They gathered every Thursday night at a concrete block building off Route 9 called The Pit, and what went on in there was mostly boring: beer, cards, arguments about motorcycles and football. But what held it together was not boring at all. It was a code, unwritten, passed down like a handshake, older than any patch on any jacket. You do not lie to your brother. You do not run when your brother is bleeding. You do not look away when someone who cannot fight is getting hurt. That third rule was the one that was about to cost them everything. The town of Harlan Creek had been dying for 20 years, the kind of slow leak death that comes when the mill closes and the young people leave, and the only ones who stay are the ones who cannot afford to go anywhere. The Iron Vow had roots there. 3 of the senior members grew up on those streets, and even after the streets went bad, they never fully left. They kept a garage on Polk Avenue, did cheap work for people who needed it, brought food around during the holidays without making a show of it. Nobody thanked them. Most people crossed to the other side when they saw the patches coming. That was fine. They did not do it for the thanks. On a Tuesday in late October, a woman named Carla Reyes walked into the pit with a split lip, a broken phone, and a 9-year-old boy holding her hand who had not said a word in 2 days. She did not know these men. She had never spoken to any of them, but she had nowhere else left to go because the people she was supposed to trust, the people with the badges and the desks and the uniforms, were the ones who had put her here. She sat down across from a man named Dutch, the chapter president, a former army sergeant with a silver beard and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and she told him everything. When she finished, Dutch did not say a single word for almost a full minute. Then he looked at the boy, and the boy looked back at him, and something in Dutch's face changed in a way that nobody in that room had ever seen before, because Dutch had a son once, and his son was buried in a cemetery outside Tulsa, and that was a door Dutch kept locked, until now. What Carla told Dutch that night was not just a story of one woman in trouble. It was a story about a machine, a quiet, patient, deeply embedded machine. And that machine had a name. And that name wore a sheriff's star in Harlan Creek, and it had been running for 11 years without anyone strong enough to stop it. Until 41 men with nothing to lose and everything to prove decided that tonight was the night the machine broke. The next morning, Dutch called church, a full chapter emergency meeting, every member required, phones off, no exceptions. He stood at the front of the room and did not raise his voice once, which was how the men knew this was serious, because Dutch only went quiet when the thing he was carrying was too heavy for noise. He laid it out clean. A county sheriff named Gerald Marsh had been running a protection racket across 4 townships for a decade, bleeding dry every small business that could not afford to say no, and when Carla's husband had gathered enough to expose him and taken it to the state, the man had disappeared, not arrested, not investigated, just gone, like smoke, like he had never existed at all. Carla had taken the boy and run. She had gone to 2 churches, the county social services office, a legal aid clinic 60 miles north, and a newspaper that had received her call and never called back. She had been living in her car for 6 weeks when she found the pit. Dutch asked for a vote, which was technically required but also entirely unnecessary, because before he even finished the question, every hand in the room was already up. They did not vote out of obligation. They voted because every man in that room had spent his life watching people like Gerald Marsh go untouched, and they were done watching. The plan was careful. It had to be. These men knew what happened to people who moved on a sheriff without evidence. They got buried in their own charges: conspiracy, assault, obstruction, whatever the system needed to make the inconvenient people disappear. So they split into teams. 2 men with backgrounds in logistics started mapping Marsh's operation, his collectors, his routes, his schedule. A member named Priest, who had done 2 years of law school before a DUI derailed everything, began building a paper trail from public records. Dutch reached out through back channels to a retired FBI contact who owed him a favor from a situation in 2009 that nobody ever discussed out loud. They were not reckless. They were methodical. But on the 3rd day, a black Suburban started parking outside the pit, just far enough down the road to be legal, just close enough to be a message. And the message was clear. Somebody already knew they were coming. The Suburban turned out to be 2 of Marsh's private contractors. Not deputies, not official, just men on a payroll who did the kind of work that could not be logged. Their names were Decker and Voss, and they had a reputation in 3 counties for making problems go away before they became problems, which meant they were not there to watch. They were there to act, and the question was only when. On the 5th night, they acted. A member named Rook, 26 years old, quietest man in the chapter, the one who remembered every face and every name, was followed home from a parts run and run off Route 9 into a ditch at 60 miles an hour. His bike was destroyed. His collarbone was in 3 pieces. He was alive because the ditch was shallow and because he had been wearing a full helmet, which he only wore because his daughter had asked him to start wearing it again. And that detail, that small, accidental grace, was something nobody could explain and everyone quietly acknowledged. Rook made it to a hospital. Decker and Voss made it back to whatever hole they came from. Dutch got the call at 2 a.m., and he sat in his kitchen in the dark for a long time before he moved, because now the calculation had changed. Now it was not just about Carla, not just about her missing husband, not just about 11 years of a corrupt machine grinding the town down. Now it was about Rook. And when you put a man's brother in a hospital bed, you have stopped making a threat and started a war. But here was the thing that Marsh and his contractors did not understand, had never needed to understand, because nobody had ever pushed back far enough for it to matter. The Iron Vow did not fight angry. They fought patient, and patient is so much more dangerous. Because somewhere in the documents Priest had been pulling, in the public records and the property filings and the tax assessments that nobody had ever thought to look at all at once, there was a name that appeared 5 times in 6 years attached to shell companies, holding accounts, and a construction contract that should not have existed. The name was not Gerald Marsh. The name was a county judge, and that changed everything. The moment Dutch saw that name, the Honorable Raymond Cates, appointed in 2014, re-elected twice, donor lists thick with Marsh's money, he stopped being a biker with a grudge and started being something more dangerous. A man with a complete picture. Because Marsh had power, but Cates had legitimacy, and legitimacy was the thing that had kept the machine running all these years. Everyone who had ever tried to go at Marsh had gone at him from the front, and the front was where all the teeth were. The judges who dismissed the charges, the DA who lost the files, the journalists who got threatening letters from law firms, all of it connected upward into Cates. And nobody had ever pulled that thread because nobody had ever thought a small-town racket went that high. Dutch called his FBI contact on a Thursday morning, a man named Carver, retired, living in New Mexico, who picked up on the second ring like he had been waiting. Dutch sent the documents encrypted through a method Priest had set up, and Carver called back in 4 hours and said 3 words. This is enough. But enough for what and enough by when was still not clear, because federal investigations moved like cargo ships, slow and inevitable and impossible to rush, and they did not have that kind of time. Marsh knew they were building something. The Suburban was gone, but the pressure was not. 2 members had been pulled over for nonsense traffic stops. One of the shop's suppliers had been told his business would be audited if he kept dealing with them, and a rumor was circulating in town that the Iron Vow was running drugs through Harlan Creek, a rumor with no truth and a very specific source. They were being squeezed, and Carla and her boy were still in a safe house 2 towns over, waiting. So Dutch made a call that he knew might end the chapter, might end his freedom, might end everything. He called a meeting not with his men, but with every small business owner in Harlan Creek who had ever paid into Marsh's machine and kept their mouth shut out of fear. He called them to the pit on a Saturday afternoon. 19 people showed up. 3 more sent written statements by hand. And when Dutch stood in front of them and told them what he had and told them what he needed and told them plainly that he was not asking them to be brave for him, but asking them to be brave for each other because the machine only worked when everyone stayed silent, something happened in that room that Dutch had not expected and could not fully describe afterward. People started talking, not whispers, voices, real names, real dates, real amounts. Years of swallowed fear coming out of 22 people in a concrete block building off Route 9 on a gray October afternoon, and the sound of it, Dutch said later, was one of the most powerful sounds he had ever heard in his life. What happened next was not a single dramatic moment. It was a series of quiet, coordinated, precisely timed moves that hit Marsh's operation from 4 directions at once, and it happened on a Wednesday, which is the least dramatic day of the week, which was exactly the point. Carver had spent 6 days coordinating with a federal prosecutor in the district who had been watching Marsh for 2 years without enough to act. The sworn statements from the business owners pushed it past the threshold, and warrants were issued before dawn. At 6:47 a.m., Gerald Marsh was arrested at his home, in his bathrobe, by federal agents who had been briefed by a retired FBI man working from a kitchen table in New Mexico. At the same time, Judge Cates was being met at his courthouse by 2 agents with a different set of papers. Decker and Voss were picked up at a truck stop off the interstate, which suggested they had already been running, which suggested someone had tipped them, which suggested the net was not perfectly clean, but it was clean enough because they were both in custody before noon, and the tip, wherever it came from, had not saved them. Dutch had stationed members at 4 points around Harlan Creek that morning, not to act, but to witness, because he believed that the Brotherhood had an obligation to see what it had started all the way through. Rook, arm in a sling, collarbone still healing, had insisted on being at his post, and nobody told him no because nobody had the right to. Carla Reyes was brought back to Harlan Creek that afternoon by 2 members who drove in total silence both ways, because some moments do not need commentary. Her husband had not been found. That investigation was ongoing, and the truth of it would take more months and more digging and would carry its own grief. But what had been done to him was now documented, named, and pursued by people with the actual authority to pursue it, which was more than it had been 2 weeks ago. Carla stood on the street outside what used to be her house and looked at it for a long time, and the boy beside her reached up and took her hand, and it was the first voluntary gesture he had made in 3 weeks. Dutch watched from across the street and did not cross over, because this was her moment, not his. The Iron Vow did not hold a celebration. They did not give speeches. That Thursday night at the pit was exactly like every other Thursday night. Beer, cards, arguments about motorcycles, except that every man in the room was a little quieter, a little stiller, carrying something they could not fully name but would not put down. 41 men who had been told their whole lives that they were the problem, that the leather and the bikes and the noise made them the thing decent people needed to be protected from, had just done what the decent people and the institutions and the systems had failed to do for 11 years. They did not need anyone to say it out loud. They already knew. And in the end, that is the only kind of justice that stays, not the kind you ask permission for, but the kind you go out and take, with your hands, for someone who can't.